Violence isn't the answer. That's a statement I've heard my entire life. It gets repeated like a moral slogan, especially whenever oppressed people begin talking about how to overcome the systems that are crushing them. And every time I hear it, I can't help but feel that in many cases, it's disingenuous, sometimes even insulting. Because when you actually look at history, when you study it without emotion and without trying to sanitize it, you realize that power and the force to enforce it has often been the deciding factor in restoring balance. I've always felt that the people who confidently say violence isn't the answer are often the people who don't possess the power to defend themselves in the first place. So they cope. They convince themselves that moral superiority will somehow substitute for strength. They adopt the phrase as a shield because they don't have a sword. There's also the hypocrisy of those who have oppressed you, lecturing and even shaming you for considering violence as a solution while they have the boot on your neck. Or when they claim that violence is never the answer, yet stockpile hundreds of missiles as a violent deterrent. If they truly believed it, they would not need such investment in weaponry. They understand the concept of their right to armed self-defense, but condemn others from doing the same. Now don't misunderstand me, I understand the sentiment behind the phrase. I understand that when most people say violence isn't the answer, what they're really condemning is irrational violence, chaos, senseless bloodshed, brutality without structure or purpose. And I agree with that. Uncontrolled violence destroys everything in its path, including the people who unleash it. But history shows us something else. Calculated, structured, disciplined force has often been used to stop evil when evil refused to bend to reason. Look at Nazi Germany. It wasn't kind words, appeals to empathy or compassion that stopped that regime from spreading across the world. It was violence organized on a global scale that dismantled that machinery. Look at Haiti. The enslaved people didn't secure their freedom through peaceful negotiations or polite treaties. The Haitian Revolution was violent, it was bloody, and it forced France to bow. It forced the world to recognize its autonomy. Without that uprising, there would be no independent Haiti. And let's be honest, oppressors themselves have always used violence to achieve their objectives. Colonization was violent, slavery was violent, coups are violent, assassinations are violent, economic exploitation backed by military threat is violent. So when someone says violence is never the answer, I often wonder, never for whom? Because historically, it has clearly been an answer for those seeking power. And it can also be an answer for those seeking freedom. The idea that evil can only be defeated through kindness and patience only works if the person you're confronting has a conscience. It only works if there's some shared moral framework. But what happens when you're dealing with people who don't value your humanity? What happens when compassion is interpreted as weakness? You can look towards the oppressed to find your answer. Maybe instead of saying violence is never the answer, we should say violence should not be the first answer, but ultimately becomes an answer when every other option has been exhausted. If someone breaks into your home and threatens your family, you're not going to sit down and debate philosophy. You're going to defend your household. If your country is invaded, you defend it. Defense at its core is organized violence in response to aggression. It may not be something people want to admit publicly, but we need to stop pretending that force has never played a role in shaping history or protecting communities. I wanted to give you an example of something I thought of. As you guys know, Malcolm X once said that the black woman is the most unprotected woman in America. That statement implies that there are women who are protected, and historically, that protection has been enforced through power and, yes, violence. Throughout American history, white men used brutal force, lynchings, and terror in response to any perceived harm against white women. From the perspective of black Americans, that violence was horrific and unjust, but from the perspective of those who wielded it, it was a tool of intimidation, and it worked. It instilled fear, it shaped behavior, and most importantly, it sent a message. The same pattern can be seen in the assassination of good African leaders who attempted to chart independent paths for their nations. Those acts weren't random, they were strategic. They were violent measures taken to preserve geopolitical interests. So when I say we should not rule violence off the table, I'm not glorifying chaos. I'm not advocating recklessness. I'm talking about disciplined, calculated force used as a last resort when survival is on the line, when all diplomatic, political, and economic avenues have failed. If you objectively study human history, you'll see that oppressed people have often had to fight back physically to secure freedom, not because they wanted to, but because they were left with no other option. And I do think, especially within our community, there has been a subconscious pressure to distance ourselves from anything associated with violence. I believe we do so because we want to separate ourselves from those who have oppressed us, but in turn have unintentionally made us weak and vulnerable, both mentally and physically. We've been stereotyped as violent for so long that we overcorrected ourselves when there was never anything to correct in the first place. We reject the concept entirely because we're trying to prove something, but that overcorrection has become a trap, a way to neutralize us psychologically. There's also a religious dimension to this. Many people say they'll leave punishment in God's hands, and I understand faith. I am of faith myself. But if you claim to believe in God, whether as a Christian or a Muslim, then you also believe that you were given a mind, a body, and agency. Autonomy implies responsibility. If you stand by and watch evil flourish when you have the ability to stop it, are you truly innocent in that scenario? Think of it this way. Would your own father be proud of you if you stood by and watched someone innocent be harmed when you had the ability to intervene? If the answer is no, then the logic applies universally with God. Passivity in the face of evil is not virtue. It can become complicity. And in my race, this religious component, especially amongst African Christians, has become extremely detrimental to our survival. If you claim to believe in God and claim that God blessed Africa and gave the continent to us, then how can you sit by and watch evil desecrate God's gift to us? And then there's this notion of patience and time. People always say, just wait, change takes time, be patient, history will correct itself. But I want you to really sit with that idea for a moment and ask yourself, patient for how long? And at whose expense? Because what patience often becomes, in reality, is delay. And delay doesn't eliminate suffering, it transfers it. It shifts the burden from your shoulders onto the shoulders of your children, and then from your children onto their children. Patience and time, when misused, don't solve injustice. They normalize it. They stretch it out. They make it survivable enough that people adapt to it, but never strong enough to dismantle it. There comes a point where we have to stop romanticizing endurance. Endurance is admirable, yes, but endurance without action becomes generational suffering, and at some point we have to ask ourselves, are we enduring for a purpose, or are we just enduring because we're afraid to confront what it would take to change things? At some point, thinking about the future means more than hoping it gets better. It means making it better, even if that requires discomfort, sacrifice, or risk in the present. Because if we refuse to address injustice decisively in our time, we are essentially deciding that our descendants will have to address it in theirs. And here's the kicker that always annoys me. The people who aren't oppressed, the ones who aren't living under the pressure, who aren't feeling the weight of it every single day, are always the loudest when it comes to telling oppressed people how they should respond. It's easy to have a polished moral attitude when you're comfortable. It's easy to preach restraint when your livelihood, your safety, your dignity isn't on the line. It's easy to talk about the right way to resist when you're not the one being crushed. As if oppression comes with a rulebook. As if there's a neat, approved, socially comfortable method to dismantle systems that were never built with your humanity in mind. And what makes it even more insulting is when the very people benefiting from the oppression, or even participating in it, start giving advice. I've seen it happen over and over again. The oppressor or the beneficiary of the system suddenly becomes a moral instructor. They tell the oppressed to be calm, to be peaceful, to be patient, to be constructive, to protest in ways that don't disrupt anything, to fight in ways that don't make anyone uncomfortable. Again, I'm not talking about impulsive, emotional violence. I'm talking about decisive, strategic action taken when absolutely necessary. And when it's the only language your adversary understands, you must speak it fluently. History shows that power respects power, and sometimes forces the final language spoken after every other language has failed. That's all I wanted to say. Whether you agree with me or not is up to you, but I prefer to be pragmatic rather than dream. Anyway, that's what's been on my mind. Let me know what you think. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.